Okay, well, I think we'll go ahead and get started while people are settling in. We like to welcome everybody here to our ETE Faculty Forum today, and the topic we'll be discussing is classroom management and student behavior management. So we're very privileged today to have our panelists here who are kind of a cross-sectional representation of different colleges here on campus, and they all have a lot of experience teaching various sized classes, various types of disciplines. So, and this is going to be an open Q&A session. So I have a number of questions. I'm full of questions, but as other people have questions, you are more than welcome to ask. What we'll do is we'll pass the mic around to those who do have questions. And we're recording this session so that other people can come and watch it later. And so we'll be just trying to make sure we're speaking to the mic for that purpose. But I'm going to go ahead and pass the mic down and let our panelists introduce themselves and tell us a little bit about where they're from, what kind of classes they've taught, how long they've been here at USU, and anything else interesting they might want to say before we go ahead and get started.
Hello, I'm Brad Davidson. I'm associate professor in chemistry, and I've been here for about 18 years. I was on the faculty at University of Hawaii for a while before this, but I focus on teaching now, and I teach several kinds of general chemistry and organic chemistry. And so mostly they're big classes. The smallest I have right now is my small, 60 people up to about 275 students or something. So they're mostly big lecture halls.
I'm Becky Laver. I am an assistant professor in agricultural education. I've been here at Utah State for 6 years, but prior to that, I was a high school agriculture teacher in Nebraska. So I've been teaching for about 18 years when you add everything together. My class sizes typically are fairly small and major specific. So I've had class sizes as little as 4, clear up to about 40 students, depending. I currently teach a graduate class on classroom management, motivation, and guidance that's geared towards our high school teachers that are out in the field. So that's kind of some of the experience that I bring to this panel.
I'm John Engler. I teach in the English department. I've been here at Utah State about 13 years. I teach mostly gen ed classes in English, so the composition courses, English 1010, 2010, as well as some lit classes. My classes are usually about between 25 and 35 students, so that's kind of where I'm at.
John, we may have started the same year. I came in 2003.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm Nathan Strait. I'm also in the English department. I guess I'm the outlier here in a way. My office is actually in Brigham City, and I teach primarily, although I also teach gen ed classes, I teach primarily for the English teaching emphasis of the English major, but for students at other locations. So almost all of my classes are IVC, interactive video conferencing. And I'm actually teaching for the very first time in 13 years an online class. I haven't ever done that, but I'm doing that right now. But most people think when I say I do distance education, they think I teach online, and that's not the case. So I do meet with my students, and it's two-way video and audio, but they're dispersed throughout the state. So also my teaching, even though it's primarily undergraduate, is once a week for 2.5 hours. So some different formats. My classes are not very big. Part of that's the reality of distance ed, but they range from about 8 to 20. So.
Okay, so we have a number of different teaching modalities as well as disciplines, class sizes. So this is good. We'll have an opportunity to get a lot of different perspectives. So I'll go ahead and start off with the first question, then we'll see if there are other questions. If there are, I'll just ask that you please raise your hand, and you can do that while somebody else is talking or whatever, and I can come and get you the mic. So We'll find out. So Travis was asking if that's classroom management. All right, so I'm just going to start out with a general question that I think might be worthwhile to talk to today. So, and I'm wondering what are some tricks that you use to get all of your students engaged, and not just necessarily the ones on the front row or the typical culprits who speak up. Do we have any? That question comes. That's another question I have for later. Yeah. So,
Whoever wants to, I can. So one of the things that I think is really important to start any conversation about classroom management or motivation with is your ability to be an effective teacher. And there are about 10 or 12 characteristics of effective teachers that happen way before you even step into the classroom that can be proactive for you as a teacher. One of them is that you have clarity in your instruction, clarity in your lessons, clarity in the directions. There's variability is another one. Variability is your ability to change up what you're teaching. Lectures very non-engaging when you have those students in the back row still on their cell phones. Name dropping. Travis? So there's clarity and variability. You have to have a little bit of enthusiasm when you teach to help get your students excited and motivated. Teaching to your objectives is another characteristic that when you outline your lesson for the day, you have objectives, you teach to those objectives, and then you evaluate over those objectives. So making sure that what you say you're teaching, you teach, and you test to. I've got to remember clarity, variability, enthusiasm, teaching to the objectives, and being task-oriented. That's another one. So those things you can do proactively, and as you're teaching, I think can help you start that way to get students engaged. But some of the interesting things are not interesting, but things that I do in class, I do a lot of group and individual presentations. Of course, I'm teaching people how to be teachers, so that's just typical of what we do. Questioning strategies, use a variety of different questioning strategies with students, small group work. And then I just discovered something while having these students complete a micro teaching so that I can evaluate their teaching. One of them brought this, you guys are all familiar with clickers, right? There's an app that you can download on your phone called Plickers. It starts with a P. I don't know if anybody has used that yet. But instead of making every student buy a clicker, you do the Plickers. I think you can get up to about 50 for free. But they have you print off it's like a QR code, and then you just scan with your phone, and you can get their answers instead of having them. That's something that I'm trying this semester with my group of 40, just to make sure that they're all engaged. You preload 4 or 5 questions, start the class that way, and do some review, and do that. I do a lot of name dropping when I see students that are not paying attention. Ask them to provide feedback. My philosophy when I teach is to make sure that what I'm teaching is meaningful, and so I like to use a lot of student examples and have them connect what they're learning to the real world. So those are some things that I do. Anybody else?
So I think this is an excellent question, especially, in my big classes, I teach over in the business building, and it's like a big theater, and it seems almost dark in the back, and, it's hard to even see those people. So I know that there's some that are not as much paying attention, but a few things that I try to do, I try to give them something to do, it's kind of primarily direct lecturing. But I give them kind of pre-lecture outlines. I teach now with an iPad and an app called Explain Everything, where I can show essentially the slides. I can annotate them as I go through, and so hopefully they're keeping up with some note-taking, but it's not so much from scratch that they can't hopefully keep up. And if they If they can't keep up, then they know that they can go back. I post, recorded lectures, the lecture captures on Canvas, onto YouTube, and then I link to Canvas. I post the notes, and so a lot of students go back, outside of class to check those things as well. I use clickers, but so far I've mostly only done one kind of clicker question at the beginning of class. Helps encourage them to come. It's kind of a review of the past lectures material before I start into new things. I think maybe I'd like to do more during class, but I'm afraid of getting bogged down. And then I try to throw out questions just in general, but then the challenge is, like you had written on the sheet, Neil, is that, obviously the ones right in front sometimes answer so quickly that it doesn't give anybody else a chance. But I've had success a few times where I have specific students that answer very quickly that I kind of casually talk to them as individuals outside class, and I acknowledge that, I know that they know these answers and show them that respect, but then ask them maybe to hold back a little so other people can participate as well. And that's worked pretty good sometimes to get a broader group answering questions.
So, because of the way I have to teach my classes, I had to change some fundamental things, and I think they're applicable here. I, for the most part, don't ask open-ended questions. So here I am in a room that may or may not have a student in the room with me. And on a screen, I can see up to 9 other sites with students, anywhere from a group of 10 in a room to a single student with varying levels of technology. We're all hooked up to a video and audio, but they have to activate a mic. They have to, break in. So asking the question, anybody have any thoughts about this, is not a very effective thing to do. But I know a lot of faculty are a little hesitant just to call on people by name. I'm not. But a lot of folks are a little wary just to sort of pick somebody out and say, well, what do you think about this, right? And it can cause anxiety in students. So I'm willing to do that, but I've changed a few things, I think, to make that more effective. For one thing, because my classes meet for 150 minutes, which is too long even for graduate students, and we're talking about undergraduates who have been working for most of the day, I've broken it up. And if you don't use Canvas, I really recommend that you do. Because one way to get students engaged is to give them multiple ways to engage with the class. And we have discussions, and my lectures I try to make them less lecture and more discussion, more sort of guided discussion. But I know that not all students will be equally prepared or comfortable participating in that discussion format. So I always try to make the class have multiple places where students can contribute. And that means that each week my classes look like this. I'll meet for an hour and a half in that discussion, and then the last hour of the course moves on to Canvas. And it's a written discussion component that comes out of the class meeting. And then we also come back to the next week. So I generally begin my face-to-face discussion by referencing student work that they've done. And so I can actually ask students to participate in that way, talking about work that they've already produced and that they've thought about and that they've published on Canvas, and all their peers have had a chance to see it. So the idea of engagement for me is just it's a necessity, because at a distance, I really won't even be able to see your facial features clearly unless you happen to be the big screen, and then it's still a little bit dark. You can be eating, working on your phone, and those things are reasonable, right? These students haven't had dinner. They may have come from a full-time job, and they have families, and they may have children that they have to keep tabs on. So I can't just tell them, you can't have your cell phone out. It's an unreasonable thing to do. So basically, I changed my whole approach to classroom management. But I think it's relevant for any class. And if you don't use your Canvas site for your course, I'd really consider it not just as a warehouse for documents, but as a place for students to go and engage in a different way.
So my way of thinking about this is that students really love to learn. They actually love to learn. When they're really actually learning something, that means they're happy, they're engaged, they're excited, they're right all the way in. And if my students are disengaged, it's because I haven't given them that real opportunity to learn. I haven't created the environment where that learning can truly happen. And frankly, the way we have classrooms set up, syllabi, a class, the teacher at the front, and students sitting in desks, that really actually dissuades really engaged learning from happening. It's just an old model of teaching, and it's really challenging for us to kind of engage students in this setting, especially when we get into huge lecture halls. In my classes, students design their own education. They write their own syllabus. And of course, I collaborate with them on that, but they engage in their own projects. And so class time is used in the ways that they want to use it. So they design how class time happens. And so they're engaged because they're the ones that planned it. They're the ones that designed it. They're the ones who created their own homework assignments and their own reading assignments. And so when they come to class, it's more of kind of a workshop. It's kind of a self-driven workshop, and they're collaborating in groups, and they're working on their own things, and I'm working around the room and collaborating with students, sometimes one at a time, sometimes in groups. But sometimes students are in the front teaching, doing presentations, a variety of things. But the real trick for me is trying to figure out how do I actually get students to grab hold of that learning, that passion that, I mean, all of us love learning, and we know what fun it is. That's why this is our profession, is because we've loved it so much we decided to spend our whole lives doing this thing, right? I think everybody who actually learns a thing, right? And these kids go out and they're always learning, whether it's, playing their video games, or whether it's longboarding, or whether it's, restoring a old Mustang, or whatever it is. They're learning, and they're researching, and they're looking and processing. And so, I mean, learning is just a natural human condition, and we all love to do it when we're actually doing it. And so in my classrooms, if I see people who are disengaged, it's because I know I just need to reach out to them and create an opportunity for them to learn that hasn't quite come to them yet.
Okay, do we have any burning questions out here? I'll repeat his question. Okay. Just like, so the question was, what do you expect behaviorally of your students?
No, we know, especially, I can only imagine the horrors of organic chemistry. But John and I are teaching the composition courses, and part of your work is to convince. Yeah. He said he made a career out of loving learning. I made a career out of avoiding chemistry. So, and math actually, but that there's a degree to which we have to convince students that there's a value to the course, especially for some of the general education courses. And you wish you didn't have to do that, but you need to do that. But we all remember the moments when we were in classes that we didn't feel like were directly relevant to what we were doing. And one of the things that I think is a key job that we have is to help students understand the relevance of what the class, what our specific class is for their larger educational and career endeavors. And so that's a way to start. But I do specify, on my syllabus that there are standards of behavior that students, need to acknowledge. But I base mine in the idea that we're a learning community, and that they are, God out there. Everybody's looking out there. This is what it's like, focus, people. Right. But sometimes it helps, depending on your classes, depending on your subject matter, whether or not students are responsible to each other for the work in the class. If you do group work, if you do peer work, I think that can be helpful. But I think you can make that argument that anything we're doing can engage you for the time that we're doing it. And, here you are, and you're not expected to, we're not expected to sort of make sure, I disagree a little bit with John, not that we shouldn't all be working to figure out how to engage our students, but we're not responsible for them being engaged, right? In the sense of they need to be there with that understanding that they're paying for their education. Right? They are, they're the ones who've signed up for this. And so we've got a kind of collaboration that goes on. And so I do have a little section, on the syllabus, but really it's about just kind of ongoing, week after week, sense that we are collaboratively engaged in this process of making the class successful.
Behavior. It's an interesting one. It makes me think of I think it was last spring semester, a class that I had I think there are about 15 students in there, and I really didn't have any expectations written in my syllabus about cell phone use or being able to use their laptop or anything of that nature. However, I had one young lady that constantly had her laptop open, and no matter how hard I tried, if I walked behind her desk and stood there and lectured and watched her play on Facebook, she had no clue that I was back there. And when I think some of it comes down to student readiness to learn, so their ability and their willingness and where those are lined up. So they might be able, but they might be unwilling, or they might be unwilling, but they might be able. And so trying to figure out if you're more of a dictator with how you manage the behavior or more of a coach, or you do more delegation, I think you kind of have to figure out where those students are at. In her case, I think she was unable and unwilling, and I really just needed to take her by the hand and say, I need you to not use your laptop while you're in class with me because it's distracting me and everybody else.
Readiness is really the question because 18 to 20-year-old students may be very different than 55-year-old students, and readiness can be. I have a student who knits throughout class, but she's still tuned in. But that's the thing, and of course I have no idea what's on the actual screen of their laptops at a distance. I'm just going to assume that they are actively taking notes because it makes me feel better. But yeah, that question of readiness is really important. I expect my students to sort of be ready in their, they're really sacrificing a lot in order to continue their educations, but they may have no idea how to use Google Docs or how to, even attach a file. So it's a different question. It really does matter the specific class and the population.
Well, and part of it for me too is, I think about students in terms of if they're engaged in some distracting behavior, it's because they're not engaged in the behavior of the learning in the classroom. And so my thinking on it is if we can find a way in the classroom to keep them busy enough with the learning and actually, engaged in the learning, then all the other behavior problems just kind of go away because they're actually doing something and connected. Now, if they're at a single student on some side and sitting in a classroom by themselves and there's just a video connection, that's a whole different scenario, right? But in a classroom where there's things to get done, as long as we can kind of keep them on task, and this is where group collaboration really makes a difference, is because they become responsible to one another rather than to me. And so they tend to naturally understand, okay, this is a peer of mine. I can't, go off and do this other thing because we've got to get this thing done. And they've got a group project that they're working on or a research proposal or whatever it is that they're working on. Then they're engaged and they can get it done. And so I invite all the technology. I don't have any rules of behavior in my classrooms. Bring anything and everything you want. And really, the classroom is theirs. They own it. They decide how we're going to use the projector and the board and the screen and the time and the class, because then they own the time. They've made decisions on how to use it, and the behavior problems just kind of disappear from the room that way.
Well, I think in some ways one advantage or one positive thing that I have, say, in the big organic chemistry class is that many of those students are very motivated, if in the beginning for no other reason that they need to get a good grade to try to get into medical school or dental school or something like this. So they come in with a high motivation for that, and hopefully, and I think, from my evaluations and things like this, the comments that I get back in that process, they start at that point, but then I'm able to show them along the way that there's actually interesting things that they can do. And, perhaps organic chemistry has this reputation of all this memorizing, but from my viewpoint, that I can show them that much of what we understand we can do by understanding simple concepts and trends, and we can apply that to things that we've never seen before, and we can make predictions. We can actually have problems where they have to use their imagination, which sometimes is not as popular with them because they can't just remember something that they've done and repeat it, but they have to use their imagination to think things through. So I think those kind of things, I try to use a lot of, we rationalize out, and how do we come to a conclusion, and how do we think about this, or how do I think about this? The biggest problem I think that I have in the class management is, in the big class, is the for each person it may be a small amount of chatter, but when 30 of those people are all doing that, it creates this roar that then, gets in the way of everybody else hearing. And I don't think that I've really solved that problem. I think in some ways maybe I do this iClicker at the beginning, and then I encourage discussion during that. And so I put up the question, and sometimes there's just a roar of discussion in class. It gets really loud. In fact, I kind of smile when I hear this. Hopefully they're discussing the problem and not just chit-chatting about other things. But then I think sometimes it's a challenge to get that quieted back down to continue with the rest of the lecture. So I guess I try to stress respect, not only for me, but for each other. But I think maybe I was thinking when I came over here, maybe I would try to encourage some kind of more of a peer pressure thing in class too. Try to get them to police each other a little bit. If you're being noisy, then, just give them a hint or something like that. But I think that's the biggest challenge I've had.
All right. Those are great answers. Yeah, I really appreciate. This is fantastic. I'm glad this is being recorded because it's hard to take notes when I'm on camera, but I can go back later. Okay, if there are any other questions, raise your hand. I do have one interesting question. Maybe this is one you might have to think about a little bit. But have you ever had to handle ignorant, thoughtless, offensive, or inappropriate comments or behavior in class? And what did you do? Without naming names, per se, in this case, but what did you do? Travis, exactly. Without calling out Travis in the back.
I remember a time when I was a grad instructor, and this was actually right after 9/11. It was the day after 9/11, and of course we were all distracted that day. But I had one student in the back of the room who had a little handheld radio, a little speaker on it, and he was holding it up to his ear and listening to all the news, right? Because the news was, of course, nonstop. And so I saw what was kind of going on. And it happened to be the day that my graduate mentor was in the room. She had come in, kind of my faculty member, and to observe me teach. That happened to just be the day she was there to observe me teach. And so I was kind of feeling a little extra pressure. Actually, now that I'm telling the story, I don't know if it'll be helpful or not, but it's a funny story. And I had a plan in mind. I had a plan. Here's what I was going to do is I was going to kind of, because I asked him to put the radio away because we were in class, and you could just hear it a little bit, and you could see he was being distracting in the back of the room. And I said, look, I understand why you're doing this, but we're here to have class. Could you either step out of the room if you want to listen to the radio, or could you put it away so we can have class? And he refused to do either. And he kept holding the radio up to his ear. And at that point, this faculty mentor, stepped out of the room, and I didn't know why. And my plan was to use the rest of class to kind of peer pressure him into putting it away. And so I was going to start a discussion on, this is a difficult, day, and how are we going to deal with this? And we have lots of options on how to kind of conduct class today. And the next thing I knew, the faculty member walks back into the room with the campus police and drags him out of the room. So that's one way to kind of deal with it, I guess. But don't do that, right? But don't do that. It is challenging in classes where we have lots of discussion and lots of open-ended kind of comments. Sometimes people say things that are offensive. I don't find that it happens very often that they mean to be offensive, but it's sometimes inadvertent or they don't realize they're being offensive. And so it's really challenging. But if I sense that something is said and the tone, the feel in the room shifts, that's when I really feel like I need to deal with it right then. If it's something that kind of slips under and under the radar, and we can talk about it one-on-one later. But if the room shifts somehow in that moment, then I want to call them out on it and have that conversation with the whole room, because we were all there and we all need to deal with it together. Yeah, that's a good question. And for me, I rarely have a teaching agenda for the day because the students are driving the learning, and to me, the student learning and the student experience is more important than any one thing I may have to teach that day. And so for me, any agenda I may have is secondary to what is actually happening in terms of the human moment in the room. And so I'm more than happy to set aside any ideas I might have had about what we need to cover, because for me, that moment is a huge opportunity to address bigger issues than anything I'm teaching in the room, which is, how do people get along in this world together? And so then we raise that, and I might even just say, look, I just felt something in the room shift. Something changed here, and what do we do about that? There was this comment made, and I suspect, I might even say to the student, I suspect you didn't mean to offend anybody by saying that, but maybe you can see how somebody may have been offended by what was just said, and then ask around the room, what do we do in this moment? This is a tough moment, but these are the moments that make humanity. This is, we all have to face this all the time. What do we do in this moment? How do we deal with this? We could run them out on a rail, or we could have this conversation, or we could share kind of different opinions on that, whatever that comment may have been. Yeah, let's. What happens in organic?
Right. Well, I can't remember any times when I think that there were so much questions or comments that might be offensive to other class members. I think the bigger issue is when the comments, start being focused more at me, and they start venting some, concern, put it mildly, that, I wasn't fair, that my exam was too difficult, that my material wasn't the same on the exam that I lectured on, or something like this. And in fact, I've had several times where and I'm not sure that I really handled these that well, where a group of students was really getting kind of worked up, especially after an especially difficult exam or something like that. And I think the way that I dealt with it was more to, if it's one or a few, to suggest that we discuss it, outside of class. Maybe at some point I should have just committed a whole class to trying to, address this. But sometimes in my class, because it is a challenging class and there are a lot of students that feel a lot of pressure to perform, they need their A for medical school, and so and I come from a different point of view. I want to hold some kind of standard and rigor. And on the one hand, I think that some of my exams are not as difficult as what I've seen peers give, or even over time. This has been traditionally a course where, some consider it a weed out. I remember when I first started teaching, my peers would have exams that typically had averages in the 40s, right? And then they would curve the results and they'd still have the same type of grade distribution. But I don't know if this is a difference between now and then, or Utah State versus other places, but the students don't seem to understand that approach. So they feel very hurt and challenged if they're not getting what they think they deserve for the amount of time that they feel like they've put in. So I think I'm just rambling here and maybe not getting to the point. But I've tended to try to push that, to talk to the students more on a one-to-one basis rather than getting into a big class discussion where everybody thinks I'm too hard and too unfair or something like that. Because if I start giving my perspective of history, then they think I'm just uncaring.
Okay. So I had an experience last semester with a young man I teach a leadership class, and we talk about different leadership styles and theories and different approaches to leadership, teamwork, all that stuff. And he made a comment in class one day that really put everybody in class on edge. And it was, "I know how to make a bomb from urine." And as an instructor, as the teacher standing at the front of the room, I had a little bit of a concern that, one, he was talking about making a bomb, and two, he knew how to do it. And three, from something that he could probably go in the bathroom and do in between class. But the way I handled it was, there's levels of things you can do. You can plan to ignore some of those comments that are made in class. You can tolerate some of the behaviors or comments that are made in class. And then there's, direct things that you can do, I think. In this case, I said, "Well, that's interesting. Maybe we should talk about that more after class," and went on with lecture. And after class, I said, "So tell me about your history. Where are you from?" And I got a little bit more information out of the kid. He was a disabled veteran, had served at the military. He had a brain injury. And he had all these other issues that made the comment have a little bit more context for me. After that, I contacted his academic advisor and said, "Is there anything I need to be watching for with this kid? Here's the comment he made. I just need to know." And so we kind of had this unofficial watch on him to make sure that he was okay and not saying comments in other classes and things like that. So, excuse me, I don't know if he's still around. He was a first semester student last spring, and from that point on, he made some derogatory comments towards women and other ethnicities throughout the course of the semester as well. But it all stems from his experience, and negative experience, I think, in the military. And redirecting class was always, the approach that I took. Just how to redirect the conversation to not include those kinds of comments. So interesting semester with that young man.
Yeah, I think one of the unfortunate realities too is that classroom behavior problems are not equally distributed among faculty, and it's a gender problem. It's all kinds of the expectations of our student. It's a cultural problem. So what works for some folks is not going to work for others, and issues are going to pop up differently. We do have a classroom civility policy, right? And that can be included on your syllabus, and I have a few where I include addenda that make it a little more explicit. I teach multicultural literature and Native studies and women's autobiography. So basically, my classes are about unfortunate comments that people make, right? I mean, that's sort of what we set up to do. But they range from the absolutely unintentional reference to colored people, right? But that is something you need to address. You don't want to just leave that one. It can be uncomfortable for the class, but it's inappropriate for any number of reasons. But you have to be able to address it. Two, other issues. I've really only had two sort of bad ones, and I know that part of this is also the reality that we have a very, homogeneous population in Utah, and that there are, dominant beliefs that will be in a classroom. But what I've found is those have not been a problem. In fact, it's remarkable how the context of students, and especially LDS students and their faith, opens them up in some very interesting ways to dealing with things that are radically different. And so one of the ways I deal with issues in the class is to figure out that and communicate that the purpose of education is to encounter difference, and how to do that, how to expand your world. And students are desperate to do that. They're interested in doing that. So yeah, I've had two bad things. I did once have someone quote scripture at me, which was a moment, right? It was just sort of okay. And then while showing a film on campus here one year when I was teaching, it was a Sherman Alexie film, The Business of Fancy Dancing, which is not only about natives but about gay natives. I had two women get up and leave, walk out, and that both of those are one, I was comfortable dealing with the situations immediately, but you're not always going to be. So you have to assess, is there just a threat to the comfort level? Is there a larger threat? And don't get somebody else's perspective right away. Talk to other people. There are resources for you. And sometimes you'll be in a situation where you're like, I don't feel comfortable and I don't know how to deal with this. And it's not going to ruin your class even if it ruins it for a day, right? And so make sure that if there's something going on that feels uncomfortable or potentially threatening, that you don't just think, oh, I have to deal with this and this is just my problem, right? There are a lot of resources for you, but mostly our students are remarkable. And I don't have a lot of behavior problems. And I hope it keeps up that way. I mean, 13 years, really two kind of weird situations. That's nothing.
Okay, I think we have time for another question or two. We're going to try to wrap this up around the noon hour. So if there are any burning questions, you got one back here? So the question is, how have you dealt with security in the classroom?
What do you mean? Can you say more exactly about security?
There was an incident, an individual walked into the classroom. It wasn't my classroom. They didn't know who the individual was, what he was doing there, why he sat down.
So we had an incident. So say somebody, the scenario is, let's say somebody walks in, sits down, you don't know what they're doing there. There isn't a lot of explanation. Perhaps there's a potential risk or something to that effect. What might you do in that kind of a situation?
Well, I don't think I would even know. Right? There's too many people, and in fact, I've had this is kind of sad to say, but I've been to the point of walking around during a final exam and not even recognizing some of the people. So yeah, I wouldn't even know.
It's never happened, but I think I would feel comfortable in asking if I could help them, if they walked into the classroom, because my classes are typically small.
Same. Never happened, but I think that's what I do. I just ask them what we can do.
Yeah, and I think you're implying also what happens if it gets really weird. If you get somebody who comes into a class and your classes only have one door in and out, and so I think you start just you try not to escalate anything, and I think one of the best ways, if once you ask that person, oh, can I help you? What are you doing here? If it gets weirder, I'd immediately say, okay, let's take a break, and and I'd see if I could get everybody just, go out of the room. And then I'd go to consult with somebody. If it kept escalating, I mean, we finally, I guess, had our active shooter training on campus, right? And, I'm of the mind that I don't ever want to attend an active shooter training. And I don't know that I can prepare for something like that, and I don't know that I want to. So, my idea would be just to not escalate and hope that if you need to take some measure, it would be to just, quietly get everybody out of the way.
So I have a question. Some of you have been here for a number of years. Do you have the sense that students have changed over time, the students that you work with? And if so, how? And how have you adjusted to maybe some of these changes in demographic that you've seen?
I hear that comment from a lot of people that, the students aren't nearly as well prepared, but I don't think that I've necessarily observed that at one place. I've definitely observed differences in culture at different places. So I taught for 6.5 years at the University of Hawaii, and the demographics there were much different. The students tended to be much more respectful and quiet and pretty hardworking. And then I moved to Utah State, and my feeling is at Utah State is that the students are very quick to stand up and complain if they feel like things are more than what they think they should be. They feel like they know what a difficulty level should be for a course, that they've never taken before. They have this sense of, that grade should be related to perceived time and effort. And so I have observed a very different culture at different universities, but I'm not sure that I can say that I've seen it change a lot over my years here.
I'll agree. I did my graduate work at the University of Missouri, and the biggest concerns that I had with students or issues were students coming to class hungover and trying to give presentations and going to the secretary for breath mints. Here, I don't have that problem. My challenges here are students who are working full time, who are parents, and they just have some other challenges. Some of the things that I've noticed, and maybe this is just because I was not that student in college, is that students, they kind of want two different things. They want you to have set deadlines and high expectations, but the minute they miss the deadlines, they want a little bit more flexibility to be able to turn things in, but they want the deadline. So I'm not really sure that they know exactly what they want. That's some of the changes that I've seen. The other just random things, and I'm sure you guys have all had the same experiences, are the excuses for missing class. And I hope I didn't miss anything important today. Did I miss anything important today? Yeah, class. But something that I think I would have just skipped class when I was in college. I don't think I would have asked the professor if it was okay that I missed class. But I think that's really the only things that I've noticed.
Don't ever ask any instructor if you missed anything important today.
Right. No, the one change I've seen in students over the last 12 or 13 years is the technology in their hands, right? And that's been the big difference. And of course, the difference really for them is they're much more easily distracted. And I think that's maybe partly why I've moved away from more lecturing and talking in the classroom to more kind of activity-based, engaged activity and hands-on learning in the classroom, is partly for that very reason, is because I don't intend to compete with the technology. In fact, I think the technology can be a really great tool, and I came to realize that that's where I was putting myself, as I was trying to compete with the technology, and I would argue with them to put it away or keep it out of your hands, or use it only for this thing. And I felt like I was policing the classroom, and I didn't become a teacher because I wanted to police classrooms. I became a teacher because I wanted to see students learning. And so I realized that this was maybe a good time to transition to a different type of teaching where we could make use of the technology in engaging ways rather than distracting ways.
I tend to think that an older generation's feelings about a younger generation reveal more about the older generation.
What are you saying about it?
Yeah. Yeah, I think the technology is a really good point. Again, I have a very different student population, so I'm not getting sort of what we call typically, millennial folks. But what you said was absolutely right. Even our college-age students are not your average college-age students. But yeah, the technology is a good point. I notice it myself, the way technology has affected my attention span and affected the way I think. So I do think that's an important thing.
I guess I've seen, the technology thing. Well, I get a big class. I can't see what everybody's using for that, but there are a growing number of students in my class that are taking all of their notes on some kind of notebook or pad or something like that, because I post these, lecture notes ahead that they can write on, and a lot of them I've been impressed with how they can use those for notes and highlight things, and they bring it into my office hours and they show me and they expand it and they can show me all the stuff they've been using with that. So I wouldn't want to shut them down on using technology, because some of them, maybe a small percentage, but they're using it in a very positive way as well.
This was last night, and I thought it was the coolest thing ever. I have a student, he's probably mid-40s. We were reading The Jump Off Creek, which is a historical novel set in the Pacific Northwest by Molly Gloss about a woman homesteader. And there's an aspect of it where there are journal entries that she uses, sort of these diary entries. And we were going through this discussion, and they'd written about it for the week, so we were talking about their discussion posts. And we finally got to the point where we were saying, wow, it would be so cool if we could just excerpt those out of the rest of the novel and just look at that text. He's like, well, I did that. And he had both the book, but he also had a Kindle. And I said, well, did you retype every one of those? Because there are enough that would. He said, no, actually, and no copyright violations here. He said, no, actually, I had the Kindle app, but then I found a Chrome extension that allowed you to copy text. And so I copied it, and I went through and I looked at it to see how that development worked. I can upload it. And I said, you have to. And so we put it on our class website. And so there's no way that's happening without those advantages. And it was kind of a cool moment. So yeah, the contexts for our teaching are different, and they're changing all the time.
These are great. I really appreciate it. Well, we're up at the 12 o'clock hour, and I'm going to go ahead. We'll bring this to a close. I'll give the audience one last chance to ask any burning questions that they may have on their minds, or any burning final comments that you may have on your mind as well. Okay, well, really appreciate all of you being here today, and we've still got some more food over there. Go ahead, get some food on your way out. Really would like to thank our panelists for being here today. I think they've given some very fantastic insights. So thank you very, very, very much. And let's see, our next event, for those of you who are interested in knowing in coming to these events, we have author Daniel Chambliss, who's author of the book How College Works, coming to visit our campus on February 23rd. And he'll be doing a seminar at 3 o'clock, and then also he'll be doing a smaller session for first-year faculty at 2 o'clock. And so this book's received a lot of acclaim. He's somebody who's sought after at various schools, a good speaker, a very compelling individual. So we would really encourage you to come and be there for that. This is a good opportunity to be able to participate in some really deep discussion and get some good ideas. So thank you.